Ri.9.
It says, analyze and evaluate a variety of thematically related texts of historical and literary significance for their topics, facts, purposes, and rhetorical features.
That's a lot.
That is a lot.
So rhetorical features, that's gonna be a vocabulary item that they need to know.
Okay. So
Right.
if we're talking about the learning target types in the standard?
Yeah.
The knowledge, the vocabulary.
You need to know what theme is.
Yep.
Yes.
And with these, I think it's both know and then be able to identify. I
Right.
think those are two different things.
Well, I think that's the skill, is to be able to identify.
So know and then identify.
Mhm. So I'm gonna put that under skill. Identify. That would analyze and evaluate. So the difference between analyzing and evaluating,
Mhm.
is there a difference? There's,
There's me.
let's talk about that.
Isn't evaluate where you're more like subjective
Mm-hmm.
and analysis is more just objective?
Yes. And I know we just mentioned rhetorical features, but I think that's the first place in like K through 12 that they mention the word rhetorical.
Okay. Yeah, so the 11-12 band is the first time they say rhetorical features.
I'm gonna underline that.
Why do you think that is?
It's a good question.
I know, like, I mean, they did rhetorical features previously in the younger grades, right? Yeah, so.
So that, this is probably one of the changes that we made, because that isn't a very upper level skill.
Well, and none of the other ones leading up to this say evaluate either, so
Right.
it's adding that in. So now it's not just what's happening in the text, it's more about the author's choices that's leading to what's happening in the text, and looking at it as a whole.
Yes, because it starts with, integrate and compare in middle grades, and then analyzing up through 9, 10, and then evaluation is added, 11, 12. And that's at the upper level of
Right.
thinking too.
Right.
So speaking of thinking, what kind of reasoning is required of the standard?
Well, like I said before, I mean, evaluate, the word
Yeah.
is in the standard itself.
Mhm. Which kind of goes along with critique and justify.
And you're drawing a conclusion.
Yes.
Evaluating.
I think that justification piece that James just said is gonna be important here. Not just saying and identifying, but being able to explain, fully explain, and justifying their answers. And teaching that to them, because analyze and evaluate, they've been doing the analyzation part. So I think with evaluate, pulling that in, really explaining to them, you have to justify your answers here, and you have to fully develop the retort, like how does the use of parallel structure help
Right.
the speaker or the author get their theme across?
And I would
or
say
what they're trying to say across.
at this part of their writing, but also at this part of their critical thinking, being able to make plain and justify how they got to a conclusion
Right,
is a big challenge at this level, right? That it's,
yeah.
what you see is not plain to everyone else.
Right.
And I find that when I'm saying, say more about that, or what if I said this, we have to continue to have those conversations that someone could be on the other side.
Right,
And so you want to make plain, you want to justify how you drew this conclusion, because someone else could read the same text and draw a different conclusion. And so as we move away from the answer C, it's like, look, can you show me how you got there? Can you draw me a map? And through that written analysis, through that written evaluation, I think that's a big skill that we're developing at this level.
Mhm.
is you make it plain to me, walk me around in your head.
And not just showing critical thinking, but, or not just doing critical thinking, but showing it.
That's right.
Right.
And I think by concentrating on analysis in 7 through 10,
Mhm.
that is a skill that they should, you know, be close to mastering.
Mhm.
And then pulling in the evaluation is that last piece.
Yeah. So with skills, to be able to do that, definitely identifying those rhetorical devices
Mhm.
and theme, identify. But then also demonstrate understanding of how to how to explain that fully. Like you have to demonstrate that you are able to really talk about something. Not just understand it, but talk about it. You know,
Go
go
into
from
the
here
depths.
to here. Yeah.
So what is the product that they're gonna have that's going to prove that they have that skill?
So, I mean, you could definitely use a rhetorical analysis here.
And I feel like when you're moving up in the standards, because this is 9, it requires something longer.
Mhm.
You know, like it's beefing up what the other standards were leading to.
What does that mean longer?
Like a more
Substantial.
substantial
Piece of
product.
writing.
So more than a discussion, you know, like maybe a full-on debate would be one, but with this being very much driven to thematically related texts and historical context, it seems like it's asking for writing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we could start with some sort of graphic organizer, move into a reflection, and then move into an actual essay, and you build
Okay.
as you go through these historical texts.
And I feel like that would be good with questioning, if you just had some like textual, like questions about the text, and just at the end saying, is it effective? Or do you think that this is effective? Like, what rhetorical device was used, they identify it, but then you take it a step further and say, do you think it's being used effectively, or is it effective?
Right.
I feel like that word would be really significant.
Why is it
Yeah.
effective?
Mhm. Yeah, why, justify, explain.
Well, and I wonder if this is a section where it would be helpful to, as a teacher, create text sets that are thematic or that are culturally rooted. And so it's like, okay, these were all written in the same 6 decades of each other.
Right.
What do you see? Or we know all these are talking about different periods of time, but they're all focusing on an aspect of freedom. What do you see?
Right.
Or why do you think I put all 6 of these in front of you?
They're different genres,
Right.
poem,
Exactly.
novels, short
Right.
stories.
So I think text sets and in an aspect of, yeah, like a sort of potentially multi-genre approach, potentially multi-time period approach where there's similar themes, potentially same time period, and it being the rhetoric of like, well, let's look at the larger sides, let's look at outlier arguments, right?
Right.
And this is another place where potentially juniors, there's a natural overlap with American history.
Oh,
If
yeah.
we're gonna look at abolitionists, right, like to look at the major arguments and then some of the crazy outliers, or excuse me, interesting outliers,
Yeah.
and start to talk to them about what do you see thematically, how are they making their arguments, who do you find the most convincing now that you've seen all of it, and those can be written pieces, those can be debates and dialogue in class, but I think it'd be interesting to utilize a text set in that capacity.
So speaking of text sets, what text would you use, and how do you kind of gauge how many texts to use, what genres to use, and what makes them worthwhile for the students to read?
I think one approach for text sets in terms of how many is to think about the demands of each text individually. So if you have some modern ones that are not going to make big requirements of your students,
Right.
you could have several. If you know that you're going to have these kind of heavy hitters, then maybe your text set is 4 or
Right.
3.
Or even
If
3,
you're using a
yeah.
modest proposal, you need to.
So
Well,
Right, it
you
depends
want
on the
them-
length as well as the difficulty. and-
Right.
Also, like the subject matter, you know, if part of it needs to be background information, you know, that's
Right.
part of a text set to build up to the anchor text.
That's a good point, because that
Yes.
helps build their knowledge about
Mhm.
the subject.
and you want them to read it, you don't want to tell them.
Yes.
Yes. You want them to read, that's a good point. How do you get them to read it? How do you choose a text for a text that they think is worthwhile to read?
Well, this says specifically historical and literary significance.
Right.
So that makes me think it's kind of falling back more on like the Declaration of Independence, Patrick Henry, things like that, and maybe some more modern things that you could use in the multi-time period approach. So how do we get them to be interested in those things?
I mean, even with that, yeah, you would have to,
Right.
I feel like with those, you'd have to build backwards, like start with a current event, and then say, hey, they were talking about the same stuff back in the day, you know, that kind of thing. So it's more building back.
Relate the two so they can kind of see
Right,
why
relate to
it's
stuff
why
that they've
they're here.
seen, yeah,
Right,
so they
you
know
know.
about.
We have protests happening all over the country
Yes.
right now. Well, you know, when they threw the tea into Boston Harbor,
Right.
Right.
What were they fighting for?
I mean, how are they the same and how are they different from the people who are blocking interstates?
Right.
It makes it more like interesting, and then it also makes it seem not just like, oh, something, you know, it happened in the past, whatever. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
It includes them as part of it.
Yeah.
So how do you decide what genres to use?
Again, one approach I would say is to think about demands. So if you're going to use, for instance, like a scene from a play, okay, if it's pretty accessible, right, then, okay, there's that approach and there's that perspective. But I could choose a more challenging, whether it's time period, vocabulary, length, informational text, or I could choose a more challenging poem. Because they're going to feel secure on this, and so then more likely to explore something that's going to demand a little bit more of them over here. If I'm choosing just to be able to check all the genre boxes, I'm potentially going to overwhelm them
Right.
or insult them because it feels like softball, you know, and slow pitch.
You mentioned poetry, but then earlier we were speaking about historical documents. What's the value of having a poem when you're talking about historical informational text?
I think a poem can put like a perspective on history that you don't get otherwise. Because otherwise, if you're just reading a historical text, it's just, it can, not dry, but you don't get any perspective on it, I guess. And the poem would kind of be able to,
Make it more personal.
yes.
Plus,
Right.
it shows more people. You have historical text mostly written by men, you know, white men. But you have poetry written by women, and you have short stories written by,
Right.
you know, many other, like, you can bring other types of people into it, which can be part of that thematic discussion in comparison.
So the fiction or poetry can be used to support the
Right.
informational.
Absolutely.
Well, and I think it's valuable for our students to remember that literature doesn't come out of a vacuum. It's usually in response to some aspect of the context of the history or the time of the
That is
culture.
so important.
So for them to see that, and for us to be able to utilize that as another way to access the material, that this came out of the same, I mean, potentially, this came out of the same time period, this was a direct response
Right.
to some of what was being discussed, you know, with delegates and with politicians at the time.
So that other types of genres can help students
Right.
access the text,
I think so.
understand and
Even-
analyze and evaluate.
Even political cartoons.
Right.
I mean, today, you know, like if you were to do some thematic unit around politics, modern politics, think of the things you could bring in that were not technically, you know, we wouldn't technically think of as literary, but, I mean, you can find all kinds of things on Twitter.
So, so what kinds of, like if we were to create a text set now, what pieces would we use?
For what theme, like,
To demonstrate mastery of this standard, I mean, to present to the students so that they can, you know, demonstrate their skills and have that
Well,
rhetorical
I could think
analysis.
about, with the Declaration of Independence, just like thinking about that historical and literary significance, you know, that paired with What to a Slave with Anne Bradstreet, that's all the same time period, but it's looking at three different types of people, three different types of writing, but kind of the same idea of what is America and what are we doing here. You know, so there's something that I feel like can be drawn in there. But I also feel like you could look at the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights or any of those historical documents and bring in things that weren't just from that period. It's just, to me, that's the one that I've been thinking of lately, 'cause it's what we're supposed to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, and if you were gonna look at an anchor text with like the Emancipation Proclamation, what would it look like to take in some close reads of abolitionist positions and other political positions at the time? What would it look like to bring "Oh Captain, My Captain" in, right? It's a direct response to Abraham Lincoln being assassinated.
Right.
What would it look like to potentially bring in modern movies and depictions of this time period as well? Obviously, filling out the proper paperwork to get that approved. But I think like looking at representation in film and scenes that are heated, scenes that get tense when this wasn't decided yet that this was going to be done with. And so yeah, I think potentially bringing in fiction, bringing in poetry along with challenging anchor and seminal texts could be a really nice way to show the nuance of the time that's hard to, for even me, contextualize today. There's pieces of it that are just hard to think about because it feels removed.
Well, and we talk, like, for example, when I do Raising in the Sun, students don't know what redlining is. So try to find articles that explain what that is, what the historical impact was for generations of African Americans in this country, and how, you know, that idea of being able to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, why was that so difficult for the younger family? What was in place structurally in our society that made that difficult? So being able to pull in some historical artifacts that help explain what was happening to this family. 'Cause Raising the Sun is a pretty accessible play for most of our students, but they still don't know the greater subtext that's happening. So we can look at a simpler play like Raising the Sun and then bring in historical writings and articles and things like that that are going to up the level of that play and also give that bigger text some more context.
And potentially enrich their experience with Raisin in the Sun or another text that's easily to access because
Kelly Lawson, please come to the main office. Kelly Lawson.
because for some students, Walter Lee Younger, it's like, why is he so angry?
Right.
Well, you might be angry too, right? And it helps kind of fill in that gap.
Okay. So it seems like we all have an idea of where to start with our text sets. They may not be the exact same for everybody in the classroom, but we have the product, the rhetorical analysis. So I guess we can move forward from this in our next meeting and talk about the common assessment could probably be a rhetorical analysis and something that the students haven't seen before, some text sets, some short text sets that they can respond to for the common assessment.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.